when you ask most people about citizen band radio, or CB radio for short, the first thing that springs to mind is an image of truck drivers travelling hundreds of miles across America in convoy talking to all their buddies along the way. Now, while this depiction is accurate, and while it has been portrayed in this fashion as being CB only operations in movies from the 1970s and 1980s, there is another side to CB. In fact, most houses that were in America and Europe from the 1970s and 80s did have CB rigs, i.e. radios, in their homes. Why was this the case? Well, before the internet, we did have a version of social media, believe it or not. People in the 1970s and 80s did want to communicate with their friends. And if your friends were all living generally in an area of maybe 12 miles or 10 miles or 6 miles or 20 miles, CB was absolutely brilliant for this purpose. You could arrange that at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday night, the whole group of you would meet up and have a bit of banter. So yes, going back to truck drivers, it was beneficial for a truck driver in a convoy to break the distance of the trip that he was making by talking to his friends socially. And yes, it was beneficial that if he saw another fellow truck driver coming on the other side of the road towards him, he would be able to shout out to that driver and let that driver know of any traffic jams that they were about to encounter, and of course any alternative routes that they might be able to take to get to their destination a little bit quicker. Of course, what is not depicted in these movies so much is the fact that CB was used in the home. Now, in most countries you're allowed 40 channels to use on CB. In some countries you're allowed 80. Which channels and at which power output you're allowed to put onto your antenna for these is obviously different in various different countries. Which one are you allowed to use, or which power are you allowed to use on those frequencies? Well, you will have to check with your local authorities about this, but generally, you can find these pieces of information on the internet if you so wished as well. Or, alternatively, you can make contact with me and I will certainly point you in the right direction for materials relating to this. So, CB, 40 channels. Well, channel number 19 was always called the calling channel, and the idea behind it was that if you had to search through 40 channels to find somebody, it would take you a long time in order to communicate with somebody. So channel 19 was designated as the first channel of preference that you should go to in order to find another person to talk to. And the truck drivers were always using channel 19 for this purpose. So you tune into channel 19, have a chat with another person, and then when you wanted to free up channel 19 to allow other people to talk, you would merely say, oh, let's change over to channel 15 or channel 8 or some of the other 40 channels. It was fairly arbitrary. In terms of channel 9, though, that was deemed the emergency channel. So we have 19, which is calling channel, and channel 9, which was the emergency channel. So you might be wondering, well, how do I make sure that I don't break the law by operating on the wrong frequency with this radio? Well, if you're buying a new radio, that is taken out of your hands, that decision, because all you have to do in the settings is choose which country you live in, and it will automatically set up the entire radio to work within that country's frequencies and the powers allowed in that country. So you don't have to worry about that. If you're buying a second-hand radio, and you might be wondering, well, why would I want to buy a second-hand radio when brand new ones are relatively cheap? Well, you can buy second-hand radios for dirt cheap, maybe $20 from a car boot sale. Of course, you have to make sure that it's working before you come home with it, because you don't want a metal paperweight. How do you make sure it's working? Well, that's debatable at a car boot sale. Many radios do work, but caveat emptor on that one. It's well worth, if you can try it out and make sure that it's working before you leave, all the better. I would certainly recommend that. In terms of the radio operation, how does it work? Well, you just, as long as you know the on and off button, as long as you know how to adjust the volume, and as long as you can figure out how to change the channel, which is very simple, you should be away to go. There's a button on the side of the microphone that allows you to push down and hold it. Once you do that, you're able to talk through the microphone and send out your signal. The minute you release that press the talk button, the microphone turns off and allows everybody else to talk to you. So it operates on line of sight. If you're on the top of a hill or you're in the middle of a desert or something of that nature, you probably might get 40 miles out of it. If you're in a different environment, you might get 25 miles. If you're in a different environment, it could be 12 or 10 or 8 or 2 or 1. It's very hard to tell. But the point is that depending on your environment, you can get quite long distances out of it, or you can get quite short distances. If you're driving through the middle of a forest or a wooded area, expect that the trees will bring it down to probably a mile along the road. So, scanning functions. Well, a lot of these radios have a scan function which allows you to cycle through all the different 40 or 80 frequencies to find out if there is somebody out there. Now, you just have to be careful that you set your squelch level, and we'll be getting more into squelch situation later on in a different video when we're talking about ham. But you just have to make sure that your squelch setting is set correctly so that your radio will be able to pick up on other people on different frequencies and not just stop abruptly every time it hears static. So, there you have it. Citizen band radio. Very simple to use, can get good distances out of it, can use it to talk to all your friends if you're in a nice area with good coverage. Even if you're in a bad area and you're in the middle of a city where you can get limited range, you'll still be able to talk to a lot of your friends in the area. You can get them for very cheap, $20 upwards. There is some slang and lingo that you may come across, such as breaker, which is normally indicating that somebody wants to jump in and talk very quickly in the middle of a conversation that you're having. It could be the case of that they have an emergency and they want to break in. There's 10-4, which is copy that, or I understand that, because after all, the whole idea of lingo on these radios and terminology is so that you don't have to speak in full sentences. You don't have to say, I totally understand everything that you are saying. If you can just say 10-4 and everybody understands what 10-4 means, then you're absolutely good to go. 10-20 or what's your 20 means what's your location. So straight away you only have a small bit of sort of lingo or slang that you may have to learn that other people might be using on CB, but generally speaking, even if you didn't want to learn that sort of lingo, it doesn't really matter because a lot of people don't actually use it anyway. There are no sort of license rules in terms of having to use these, so don't worry about them too much. The one piece of advice that I would give to anybody who is travelling out on a trip with their friends in convoy would be to double check that all of your radios are working prior to travel. Now, how you do this is you'd switch on all your radios and each person in turn would try transmitting on the same frequency. And all you have to do is say radio check, and if everybody else can hear those words, radio check, then you know that all the radios are working. Myself and the other tutors normally get asked very similar questions by newcomers into CB, and I'm going to address 2 of those questions in this video, and the rest of the questions I'll deal with in our online forum. The first question is, which brand or make or model of CB rig should I buy as a new entrant? I have purchased the most expensive one on the market from America, and that particular one has a very good brand name to it, very reputable. This company has been making CB rigs for as long as anybody can remember. Equally speaking, I purchased a fairly decent, I won't say cheap, but fairly decent one from Asia, and it's working absolutely fine too. In terms of CB, most CBs are going to be operating with amplitude modulation and frequency modulation, AM and FM radio. Some of them, some of the very expensive ones, have SSB, which is single sideband, which we'll describe in another video later on when we get into ham radio. But needless to say, single sideband has obviously an advantage, and that's why it's more expensive. You can get greater range out of SSB because it's a lot more efficient in terms of how it uses the radio wave. Would I recommend an SSB radio? Well, it depends. If you and all of your friends were getting SSB radios and you were willing to spend that much more money in order to do so, then maybe. It's debatable, but maybe. Because you have the greater possibility of getting longer range out of your communication. If one of your friends does not have an SSB enabled radio, then you would all have to just revert back to using AM and FM on your nice expensive SSB enabled radios just to talk to that one person. And considering that most of the population, even including myself I must admit, do not use SSB, then is it really worth spending that money? It's totally up to you. If you do want to spend money on buying a radio that does AM, FM and SSB, then that's totally your call. I personally haven't with any of my CB radios. I use SSB for ham operations, but not for CB. Because CB is a relatively localised communication in essence, so it's debatable whether I would really need SSB in my particular case. In terms of antennas, which antenna would I go with? Well, most people go for mag mounts. They put them on top of the car. It's got a magnetic mount on it, so it sticks onto the roof of the car with the magnet. And what people don't realise is it's not just that the magnet is holding the aerial in place. It's also a fact that the magnet is actually connecting the antenna to the roof, electrically speaking. So no, I don't mean that you're going to electrocute yourself if you touch your roof. I'm not talking that sort of situation. I'm talking about, in terms of radio waves, it is connected. So the roof becomes part of the aerial. This is not harmful to anybody. It doesn't do any damage or doesn't do anything. It's just, we're talking about the characteristic of the antenna. The sticky up piece, as we'll call it, is half of the antenna and the roof is the other half. So with a mag mount antenna, if you take it off your roof and you put it on your windowsill and you decide, oh sure, the antenna is sticking up in the air, sure, isn't it fine? No, it needs a grounding, and the grounding comes in the form of a metal surface that it's attached to, be that a metal table, a large metal table, or the roof of a car, because you're going to need a foot at least of space around the magnet in every direction in order to act as a grounding. So what else about these antennas? What other ones? Well, it's totally up to you. You can get little covert ones, ones that are probably only the length of a ruler, and these won't be noticed when you're driving through a town or a village. They'll just look like an ordinary antenna that you have on your car anyway. So which would I recommend? Well, I have all of them. If I'm travelling through a town and a village and I don't want to be noticed, then I'll put up one of these little covert antennas. They're not very expensive. And if I don't care and I really want to make sure that I get the maximum distance out of communications, then I'll put up my larger mag mount. But to be honest, I've driven through plenty of towns and villages in my time with the larger one, and basically nobody notices anymore. People are so busy in their modern day-to-day life that actually you'd be surprised, very few people blink an eye when they see a large antenna. Now, the last thing that I'm going to mention in this video is the most important thing. And the reason I mention it last is because most people remember the last thing that you say to them. So, what is this last point? Well, the last point is an efficient antenna is the most important aspect of CB communication. An efficient antenna. What is an efficient antenna? You can have a good quality CB radio that you've spent a lot of money on, and you can have a very expensive antenna, and you can have it stuck onto the top of your roof with your mag mount situation, but that doesn't mean anything. Your antenna has to be tuned to work with, or calibrated, or whatever wording you want to use, to work with your CB radio. How do you actually do this? Well, you get a tiny little device, which is probably only about $15, called an SWR meter. And you put it on the line, on the cabling, between your radio and your antenna. And you transmit from your radio a signal, and you see what your SWR reading comes out as. Now, if it's too high, you just have to adjust the antenna. And what I mean by that is, normally on most of these antennas there's a little screw, and you might need a little screwdriver or an Allen key to adjust it, but it allows you to adjust the height of the antenna. And by adjusting it and getting it to just the right height, you can lower your SWR reading to an appropriate amount. Now, I have tweaked mine, and I have it on an absolute perfect figure. The SWR is absolutely spot on, and I'm getting great range out of it. This is with an AM, FM radio, not SSB, and I'm getting good range. So there you have it. Get your antenna set up right, and you are absolutely flying.